Welcome to The Strategic Leader, the podcast for people-focused leaders who want to think, act and feel more strategic. I'm Gemma Dale.
And I'm Fee Craig. In this series, we're tackling the big, hairy questions shaping the world of work and exploring how to respond with strategic clarity, not just strong opinions. Hello and welcome to The Strategic Leader with me, Fee Craig.
And with me, Gemma Dale. And we're delighted to have another guest here with us today, Dr Gemma Dale. Gemma's a senior lecturer and researcher at Liverpool John Moores University, and she was an HR director, so has a great backstory on and experience in HR, and now focuses mostly on remote, flexible and hybrid work, which is the big, hairy topic of today. So welcome, a very warm welcome, Gem. And would you like to say a few more words to introduce yourself to us?
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Gemma, for that kind introduction. I'm not sure what I can really add to that, but yeah, I spent about 20 years working in operational HR, doing all sorts of things from running HR shared service centres, recruitment teams and employee relations activities. And then I abandoned operational HR for the life of an academic, and I teach in the business school at Liverpool John Moores. But as you said, my research areas are all around hybrid, flexible and remote work.
And there is our big, hairy strategic topic. I think, if we think about the question, one that often comes up is what's better? Is it hybrid or is it fully in office or is it fully remote? Which one is actually better? So I think that's our big, hairy question, which is probably, I'm going to guess, already not quite the right question to ask. But let's dive in there. What are your initial thoughts on that question, Jen?
Well, forgive me, because this is going to sound like a complete cop-out, but the answer is it depends. And that applies also to all forms of flexible working, because it depends on your organisation, it depends on the role, it depends on the team, it depends on the level of in-person work that needs to happen because of any particular reason. So there is no answer to that question, and I don't think there ever can be, because it's so contextual. And I think there's a whole load of problems that arise around that idea in and of itself, which I'm sure we can explore as our conversation goes on.
So this does feel like a topic for me where everybody is coming to it with an opinion. We all have an opinion, be that a kind of professional opinion or just a personal one as to which one suits us best. But there is such a debate, is there not, around, and has been for the last 5 years, obviously since COVID, that, this is what we need to be doing. This is what the country needs to be doing. This is what industry needs to be doing. This is what organizations in 2025 need to be doing. And so that point about it entirely depends sort of renders those big statements a bit useless, doesn't it? And so I'm really interested in what are those criteria on what you would weigh it up, and how can we sort of drag ourselves away from this one size fits all narrative about, it's 2025, everybody's trying to be heading back into the office. And surely that's not the right way to think about it, is it?
I think what you started that with is actually the biggest problem with this whole conversation, which is everybody's got an opinion. And the one thing I would say about this conversation, and this was true before the pandemic, because that's when I started to work in this space, and it's still true today, which is this debate is impervious to evidence. There is a huge body of evidence pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and that has emerged since. But people are very reluctant to engage with that research, to read it, to believe it, because we all turn up with our own opinions. And experience bias is so prevalent here. And there's a really great example of that. I won't name the company, but one pretty large UK organisation did a 5-day return to office mandate about 18 months ago. And they did a press release, probably because they know this sort of stuff gets quite a bit of attention. And the CEO was quoted in that press release and roughly to the effect of, "It's so much better when we all work together in the office. I know I feel that way." Well, I mean, talk about saying the quiet part out loud, right? But we see, don't we? We see, the Alan Sugars of this world. We see some other big industry leaders being really negative about it. But they're bringing to that conversation their own experience. This is how I work, therefore.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see all these debates? I mean, the lovely former Prime Minister Boris Johnson during the pandemic saying all these people who are working from home are just eating cheese. I mean, there's also even a level of ridiculousness that comes through in the debate. And we see these headlines all the time, and they're really, really unhelpful because what we need is evidence and data. And there's lots of it that exists. But there's a real problem with that evidence and data too, which is how transferable and generalizable is it? One of the most interesting papers, for example, on hybrid work actually was undertaken in a Chinese call center. So can I realistically, as I sit here in Liverpool today, say that that is transferable to my university or a financial services firm or any other organisation in the UK doing a very, very different kind of work? So what we need is data, but we need our own data. We need to look at our own organisations for the answers to the questions around what is the best form of work. But I don't think enough of that is happening across industry at the moment.
And that also begs the question, doesn't it, that how many, depending on the nature of the business, but how many businesses can readily measure productivity, efficiency, effectiveness within their workforce anyway? That does seem to be something that's hard to measure anyway.
But it is. It absolutely is. There's a whole other conversation there. And what happens is when we can't measure it, and some organisations can, some organisations are really great at, working out people's KPIs or their contribution. But when we can't, what we tend to rely on are like faux measures of productivity, because what we then do is we conflate performance with sort of attendance and presence. So if we can't measure whether somebody's being productive or efficient, then we'll just kind of go back to whether or not we can see them on a regular basis. Let's face it, we all know, don't we? You can go in an office and not do a great deal of work. We've all met one of those people, right? As a big social media user, who's to know if I'm in my corner office spending all day scrolling the social media platform of my choice? So turning up doesn't guarantee I'm doing anything of value or I'm making a great contribution, but that's not necessarily how we perceive it, unfortunately. So we bring all of these kind of hardwired beliefs and experiences, biases to this conversation.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, both of you, with the link between not really being able to define productivity or define performance. And we've talked before, haven't we, Fee, about definitions of performance. What is good performance? How do we begin to define that? I work with organisations on this point because a lot of the work that I do relates to performance-related bonus or the reward system that might connect to individual or team performance. And it is more common than not that I come across organisations that cannot define performance, that do not have a consistent definition or set of ideas as to what strong performance really looks like. Therefore, the default is that if we can see you, then it's effort, and we know you're turning up and putting in a shift. And whether you're actually delivering anything in that shift, to your point, is absolutely, debatable if you can't define performance in the first place. So we are kind of stuck a little bit in these biases of what worked for us that you referred to earlier. I preferred it this way, so I think it still needs to be this way. And a vacuum of being able to define performance in any other way, and therefore the default is to define it in terms of turning up to the office between the hours of 9 and 5:30.
I think there's something also around this idea of what if I can't see people, what are they doing? And I think there's like a really long tradition in management, isn't there, around that? Go back to scientific management. If any HR people are listening to this, I'll just give them a real flashback now to their HR studies. And Frederick Winslow Taylor, it was all about, I'm going to break your work down. I'm going to supervise every moment. I'm going to be in control of every moment. And I think that that idea has existed, hasn't it? We've also talked about the theory X manager, theory Y, to go back to some of those academic theories. But this idea that I need to be seeing you, or you might skive, and you might not be fully productive, is a really hard wired one for a lot of people. And shifting away from that and just going, I'm just going to trust everybody's going to get on with it. And again, I think we can see other debates here that we've seen in HR. So how often in HR do we write policies for those 2 or 3 people who are potentially going to underperform or misbehave? Instead of writing policies for the 97 or 98% that wouldn't. And I mentioned at the start of this podcast, I've had quite a long HR career before going into academia. I'm old enough to remember when the debate was about, oh, can we give people a smoke break? Because they'll make that smoke break longer than it should be. And then, the internet came along and it was like, oh, we can't possibly give people access to the internet. And my goodness, if anybody listening to this was around when Facebook was launched, I remember going to meeting after meeting about, what were we blocking on the corporate servers and all of these things. So I just see it as an extension, as the same old argument applied to a new thing, which is we're always really worried that people are going to take advantage of this guy.
So yeah, I didn't really think we'd quite so quickly get onto this topic of trust, which is kind of what all of these things have got in common, isn't it? It's just do we trust our workers to get on with it? But it's a really interesting one, isn't it? I just want to flag up one bit that you said earlier on, which I'm definitely going to keep hold of. And I think it applies to virtually everything that we've talked about so far this series, which is that idea of experience bias. So we know about unconscious biases, but we tend to think of them from a kind of DEI perspective, which is what assumptions am I making about people? But we are, as you say, very biased towards our own experience, towards what we have done, what we've seen, situations we've been in the past. And we are unaware how much that influences the way that we think. So from a strategic leadership point of view, being open to noticing that experience bias, recognizing it in ourselves, and then you saying, okay, well, then what lens does that mean I'm looking at this topic through? Is regardless of the topic, we could apply this, I think, to any of the subjects we've done here in series 4. I just think that's such a powerful thing for any leader to take away as a nugget, which is where is experience bias creeping in and what's it doing to my lens on this particular topic.
And I think if you think about the kind of return to office conversation, which has also been rumbling on for a couple of years now, decisions about return to office are very often driven by the people at the top of the organisation. Who are the people at the top of the organisation? They are people for whom the office has worked. Yes. They are people who have built their career in an office. And they are being challenged by somebody coming along and wanting something different. So their experience has been this. Can they truly recognise that other people want and need and can be productive in an entirely different way? I think it's also we need to recognise that we are also quite status quo driven as human beings. We will default to what we know, to where we're comfortable, and doing the same old thing is easier than doing a new thing pretty much always. So return to office, I would say it's looking backwards and we're not really supposed to be going that way strategically. But it's what we know, right? We don't have to change anything else. We don't have to change technology, ways of working. It's easy.
So when I think about this, I wonder how many intentional conversations have been had at the senior table in a lot of these organisations about effectiveness and productivity in the context of different working styles, hybrid, in office, etc. Because it feels to me that there's been a little bit of a suck it and see approach in lots of organisations I've encountered. I think, to build on that, immediately post-pandemic, I'd say organisations understandably probably wanted to take a fairly cautious path. They probably had a few other priorities to contend with. Then as we got back into the rhythm of work, the question of where organisations wanted to be on this spectrum of in-office to fully remote started to happen. And aligned with that, there was strong evidence emerging that talent really wanted to retain that flexibility. So there was discussions balancing those tensions as well. But in many places, it probably was a bit reluctant, the continuation of hybrid. And so I think the work needed to make it effective in lots of places hasn't been done. You mentioned change is harder than status quo. Absolutely. So those organisations haven't really figured out the systems and the working practices for the new way of working, almost trying to retrofit how we used to do things in the new context. So, surprise, surprise, the pendulum swings back again, it's not working and therefore we need to go back to how we did things before. I remember running a leadership program in an organization where I had to redesign it to be suitable for remote sessions and in-person sessions when this suck it and see mixed approach of people in the room and dialed in didn't work. And my point here is I was the one that insisted on that. The organisation hadn't done this thinking themselves, so I imagine a lot of their internal meetings were quite mixed in terms of effectiveness too. So I suppose my question here is, at what point in any of this have there been intentional discussions about this, about what type of work is done better remotely, what type of work is better in person, and so on, to the extent that there's a consistent and fully considered approach to the whole question of hybrid working in the context of the type of work that's being carried out. What's your take on that, Jem?
So a couple of things, and I'm going to make some sweeping generalizations here, and forgive me. I've seen organizations that have put real strategic thought into this, have gone into this with an open mind, who had their eyes open to new possibilities around work as a result of the pandemic, had been surprised by how easy the switch was. And, I worked with one CEO who just went, Jem, we need to do something radical. Come up with something. So there are those companies out there that have embraced it and are quietly doing brilliant hybrid, by the way. And let's not forget, we see all these headlines, return to office, because they generate clicks, right? No one's writing about the companies that are doing this brilliantly. But I think there are also organizations who went, okay, to your point, the talent wants flexibility. We need to meet that demand, which brings me on to another point. I don't think everybody really went into hybrid with joy in their hearts. They went into hybrid because they were worried they were going to lose people. And now the labour market has shifted a bit. They've got a bit more confident about return to office. But going back to my point, there are other organisations who just went, well, just let people work from home 2 days a week. And they have just lifted and shifted certain things from the office into Teams. So if you had a meeting in the office, the meeting is now on Teams. They've made no changes to the office environment to facilitate different ways of working. They've made no changes, and they haven't gone through those thought processes that you just mentioned around, which bits of work should we do in which way. And I think those are the organisations that are finding it more difficult because they haven't put the work in. They haven't made the accompanying changes that will really make hybrid and indeed any other forms of flexibility really deliver for that organisation. And I don't have evidence to back this up, but I do wonder whether those are the organisations that are pushing people back because maybe they weren't that committed to it in the first place. It hasn't gone that well. So actually, to my earlier point, let's just default to the thing that we know, the thing that will be easy and will get people in more. What we don't know yet, because we've only got a little tiny bit of research on this, is what that's going to do to those organisations longer term in respect of talent.
So, Jem, you said earlier on, and you've just referred to it now, that this is a topic, because we are also bound to our own opinion on it, because we've all got one, that it's impervious to evidence. And also, we acknowledge the fact that it's difficult to lift and shift evidence from one environment to another. But what are you seeing, or what have you seen in the research that you have done, and obviously that you've been exposed to throughout your academic studies? What have you seen that is interesting or will surprise us, or that we should really know?
So, probably a useful place to start is that all of my research is qualitative, which means I'm much more interested in people's lived experience and described experience than kind of statistics. And over the last 5 years, I've done multiple studies, open studies, and then worked directly with organisations to engage with their staff through focus groups, qualitative surveys, etc. So I think I've read thousands upon thousands of comments from people about working from home, remote work, hybrid work, right from the very beginning of the pandemic. My first survey on this was June 2020. And when you look at people's experience, it is, even when they can personally identify disadvantages, they overwhelmingly value opportunities to work in a flexible way. And I'm not just talking about location flexibility here, but other forms of flex as well. And they value them so highly that it generally outweighs any negatives that they experience. So we hear some of the negatives, don't we, around, isolation and that kind of thing from working from home particularly. But generally speaking, employees find that any negatives are massively outweighed. At the heart of people's value, at the heart of what they really want is time. Because what flexibility allows, and that's location flexibility and time flexibility, is more autonomy, more choice, more freedom. And that shows up differently for everybody. You know, for some, it's I can manage my domestic chores better. If I had £1 for every time somebody said to me, I can do the washing when I'm working from home, I would retire early. But, you know, for some people, it's I can do more exercise. It's others I can balance my childcare. Others it's I've got elder care responsibilities. Others it's I can do more of my hobbies. I spend more time outside. I have my lunch in the garden. There's all sorts of things. But at the real heart of it is people have more life when they work in a flexible way. And there's all sorts of benefits for that at an individual level. You know, it's good for well-being, engagement, job satisfaction, and that all translates into organisational benefits. People will take steps to retain access to flexibility. They will take steps to leave jobs or to look for new jobs, you know, if they're required to comply with return to office mandates. They'll also sometimes do things to their own detriment. So, for example, we know that when people kind of work part-time, they very often maintain maybe a much higher workload than they should, maybe especially if they've dropped from full-time to part-time, they often almost retain the full workload and cram it all in and work harder. But they, you know, they value it so highly. They really don't want to let it go, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep access to it. And when you force people to work in ways that make no sense to them, whether that's, you know, forcing them to come into the office to spend all day sitting on Teams because everybody else is on their work from home day, you will end up with frustration, demotivation, you know, reduced job satisfaction, etc. So there are huge benefits. And if I was say to anything around organisations, those kind of, you know, to your point, the things that we want people to know, you know, I don't think you can have one size fits all policies, even within a single organisation. The more complex and larger that organisation gets, the more you need to take it down to almost team level decisions around what works. So you've got to have that flexibility within policies. And I think that's absolutely critical. But I think the other thing that's really important is looking at your own data. What do your employees think and feel about the way that they work? And generally, the more autonomy you can give people within the boundaries of your roles, teams, stakeholder needs, customer needs, whatever your organisational context is, the more autonomy and choice you can give people, the more you can empower them to choose the way that they work best, the more organisational benefits you'll reap.
So, what would be your advice to HR leaders who are navigating this pretty heated debate in their own organisation? Let's say they've got an executive leader or several who are in that opinion informed by their own experience that we referred to earlier, effectively really strong advocates for the return to office, and see anything that is somewhat flexible around that to be a big compromise. The HR person knows through knowing their workforce, knowing some of this stuff that you've talked about, and being informed generally, that it's going to go down kind of like a cup of cold sick in the organisation. What's the best way that they can tackle this to start to really open up the debate in your experience, or from your perspective?
Do you know what? I think it's really hard for people in that position. I mean,
Mm.
I've talked to HR directors who have said to me, my organisation is mandating RTO. I don't think this is the right direction. I've had the conversations, they're doing it anyway, and now I'm the face of this policy. And, you know,
Mhm.
mine is the team that's creating the FAQs and all of this and dealing with the complaints and the unhappy employees. So I think it's a really difficult place to be for a HR professional. Can they truly influence CEOs who've got really hardwired beliefs? You know, I'm not sure that they can. The only thing you can continue to do is keep advocating for flex, keep pushing it if you think it's the right thing for your people. Challenge misconceptions when you see them, you know, when you hear opinion driven statements, you know, challenge that, share the evidence where you can. That doesn't always change anybody's mind, and keep reminding people of the benefits. I also think there is scope for future change in this space, because the one thing we haven't truly seen yet is people being really faced with some tough financial decisions, because many people who are in long-term commercial leases, 5-10 years, have not been faced with the decision around, do I still continue to pay for 2 floors in Canary Wharf or, my city centre office? And I do wonder whether or not, when those break clauses come up, when those leases come up, there might be a slightly different conversation here. Because actually, if I can, as a CEO, halve my office costs and still retain a reasonable element of productivity, will that shift anything? I don't know. I think it's just something I'm interested in to keep an eye on.
Where would you say is a good place to access some of this evidence of where it goes well?
We are starting to see now more of the academic literature emerge. We've got some really interesting papers, for example, on impact on talent pipeline for RTO. And again, there's only a handful of these papers yet, but more will inevitably come out in the couple of years to follow. I think the other really good source of data right now and thought leadership is the sort of the McKinseys, the Gartners, and the PwCs, etc. of this world, because they're doing good. Might not be in an academic journal, but they're doing really good research. They've got good size data sets. And Microsoft have also done some really interesting research in this space. So having a look around their kind of future of work trends data is really useful as well.
And you've really made me think about what's the question that you're asking, which is kind of where we started here. So if you're looking for, the thing is with any kind of research thing, you'll find whatever you're looking for just because of the bias of the way you ask the question. But are we looking for, what's best, hybrid or in office all the time? Or are we looking at other questions like you mentioned, what is the impact of RTO, mandated RTO on, new pipeline? What's the impact of being in the office or not being in the office on the younger end of the labour force? What are the other things? What have we not thought of when we are thinking about, do we just get everyone back into the office?
Yeah, I think the starting point, for me is sort of always like, how do we want our people to work to enable our organisational goals? And, how do we want our people to work in a way that they're going to be productive, efficient, be able to give their best, be engaged, be well? And if we start from that premise rather than where should they be on any given day and how many days should they spend in that place and that place, how should we work to ensure that we can achieve our goals? And those goals might be people's goals around talent. They might be broader organisational missions and objectives.
And to build on that point, I would go back to what I said earlier, which is, what does good look like? What does good performance look like? How do we articulate that rather than the context, as you say, of where is that performance happening? It's how do we recognize when we've got good performance, when we've got good productivity? What are the indicators of that? Because until we fill that vacuum, I think we're going to keep pendulum swinging between the rights and wrongs of where. Personal opinion.
Well, at least you flagged it as such, so that's a big step forward.
All right, so let's close then on something you'd love to see organisations do or to see the HR profession do in relation to this space that might shift this debate forward.
I think, if probably unsurprisingly, for us to be more evidence driven in this debate, and as challenging as that can be, for us to draw on that evidence, and when we see people drawing on their opinions and their beliefs and potentially their biases too, for HR people to be confident enough to challenge that, and the evidence is the tool for that for me.
Ah, that's great. And we talk a lot about staying strategic, and being in that strategic mindset. And it is hard, isn't it, when we're busy, when we've got lots of hot opinions in the room, to retain a strategic perspective. Have you got a belief or a mantra or a little technique that helps you stay strategic when you're looking at some of this stuff?
Oh, wow. That's a really challenging question. I think you have to sometimes take a step back, don't you? And go back to what is our primary goal as an organisation or indeed as a people team. When I was a HR director, We sort of had a gate that we had to get things through. If somebody wanted to come and pitch something new or start something new or change a policy, we had these kind of central questions we had to ask ourselves. That was my little rule. And one of them was, is this going to make people's lives better? Is this going to make us a better place to work? And I think part of it is being able to take that step back and just get out of the emotion of the moment and the conversation. And again, use that evidence and say, is this moving us forward towards our organisational goals?
That's brilliant, isn't it? And I mean, I think we've said probably less articulately than that. We've said that taking a step back so many times and asking yourself those questions. I love the idea of those questions. They're like project gates, aren't they? But almost like a mental gate to go through. Have I asked myself this question? And then you factor in what we've discussed about being impervious to evidence. And that talks to, confirmation bias. Am I only looking for what I'm wanting to prove my point? Also, the experience bias that you talked about at the beginning, and the idea that just zooming out and asking those big questions, what are we trying to achieve? How should we be working in order to deliver our goals, be a great place to work, make sure that people actually want to stay working here, and then take it from there rather than do we mandate all our team back into the office? That perspective is a really powerful thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
People to do their best work. How do we create the conditions that will enable that? That's a much better question than should they be in the office or not.
Well, I'm glad we finished this session by identifying what the question was that we should have been asking at the beginning. But that's a worthwhile use of half an hour, isn't it?
It certainly is. And Gem, what's the best way for our listeners to find you if they want to access a bit more of your research or thoughts on this topic?
Probably best thing to do is connect with me on LinkedIn. So I share all my research there, but also anything interesting and useful I find about flexible work.
Fabulous. Well, your link to your LinkedIn will be in the show notes for anyone who is interested. We'll pop a bit more information in the show notes as well. And it just leaves me to say thanks so much for giving us your time and your insights and massive expertise. I could talk for hours on this, but I think we're at time.
Thank you so much. It's been such a good sort of mentally challenging session to work through. So thank you, Gem, for your insights and sharing it with all of our listeners.
Thank you.
And until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. We'd love it if you could subscribe or maybe share with a colleague or just leave us a quick review.
And if you have a big, hairy question you'd like us to explore, or perhaps a strategic dilemma you're wrestling with, just drop us a line, gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk.
And remember, having a strategic viewpoint doesn't necessarily mean having all the answers. It's more about asking better questions, broadening your view, and staying curious.
We'll see you next time.